Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Job Fransen discussing his new open access book, The Forest Through the Trees, making sense of an ecological dynamics approach to measuring and developing collective behavior in football. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book, Learning to Optimize Movement: Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship, available now on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats. This book is the follow-up to my best-selling skill acquisition book, How We Learn to Move. In it, I discuss how we can go beyond learning basic coordination to becoming an elite mover, evidence-based principles for learning and coaching optimal movement. Take your game from proficiency to mastery. Now on to the show. Okay, today it's my pleasure to be joined by Job Fransen. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, Rob. Yeah, no problem.
Start off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of where you're working now?
Yeah, so at the moment I work at the University Medical Center in Groningen, which is in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. My background is Belgian. I did a PhD at Ghent University and then moved to Australia, where I worked almost 8 years at the University of Technology, Sydney. And most of my work is in the broader skill acquisition space. I've got an interest in childhood motor development as well as working with elite athletes. And I've usually had one foot in practice, one foot in academia, where most of my time I've worked in rugby union and Australian football.
Oh, cool. Wow. So you've well-traveled.
Yes.
Those are some really good places, too, for movement science, for sure. A lot of
That's
good places.
Right, yeah. Lots of different hats.
Yeah. And so what we wanted to talk about today was the main thing is you have a new book that you've put out called The Forest Through the Trees, Making Sense of an Ecological Dynamics Approach to Measuring and Developing Collective Behavior in Football. Football, of course, meaning soccer in my terms, right?
That's right, yeah.
Before we get to the actual details of the book, I wanted to start off with kind of an interesting, point we talked about before. You made this free and open to people. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your motivations and what you want to accomplish with this?
Yeah, I think, and I translated that a bit in the foreword of the book as well, but I've received so much from this scientific discipline and from scientific discourse with my colleagues. But the one thing that still remains difficult for me is how do we spread this really good knowledge that's embedded within the skill acquisition community, and how do we bring that out there? And oftentimes that is, not just coaches and maybe people on the practical side who don't have access to these things, but also people who live in different countries who might not have access to the databases that we have. And in this case, I partnered with Stork Kinesiology to put this book out open access, just because I wanted everyone to be able to access it, everyone to be able to access the ideas that are within it, and also hopefully start some discourse in the future where hopefully, people will come to us and say, hey, these are the guys who wrote the open access book. They're open to discuss this, talk about this, think about new ideas. And that was the whole idea. And I think, I've been in this field for 15 years now. The one thing that I think I struggle with is that in 15 years, I don't know. And obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, with the podcast, but I don't know how well we've communicated this really good knowledge that's in this field to others. And especially I started noticing that when I started working with my colleague at UTS, Franco Impellizzeri, who often mentioned, look, you've got all these good ideas and there's this great work being done all over the world by people from really, really small areas, motor development, exercise psychology, cognitive science, AI related stuff, people who work in the perceptual sciences, and there's so many good ideas, but why haven't I heard of them? Right? Why aren't they embedded in the work we do in strength and conditioning and physiology and epidemiology and injury prevention, etc.? And that's why I thought, I don't really need to publish more. I mean, it doesn't interest me either. I'm much more interested in the dissemination of knowledge as it should be from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, that's a really, I agree 100%. It's just, there's a lot of little, like if you want to do this yourself, you kind of got to piece it together and it from a lot of different sources and different, and it's very hard. It's, I think it's a struggle for people. So anything that kind of brings things together for people and connects it with applied, I think is I know a lot of people are looking for that. Yeah. That's really cool. So did you have you been followed this kind of ecological approach for a while yourself? Or is this kind of evolved for you?
Yes. I mean, for me, it started with Jane Clark's work when I worked in motor development, who talked a lot about patterns and constraints. I mean, and I find her work extremely inspirational. But I have to admit, I've never really been a part of the whole dichotomy. I've more, and this is something, I mean, this is one of the other reasons to bring out this book is I think before, we ask people to take sides, choose camps, etc. I think we have to do scientific discourse credit and follow our noses a bit, and our noses as scientists follow the evidence. So I'm trying to follow the evidence every which way it goes. And this book I wrote because I started thinking with colleagues about the concept of collective behavior. How do we behave when others are around us, right? Because ultimately what a coach wants you to do, he wants you to be cooperative in a team sport. He wants you to fulfill a specific role, but that specific role has to also contribute to the task aim. And at that time, I also worked within sport and I started thinking about how do we achieve this? How does a coach actually do it? Like, it's so complex. I don't know how they do it, how they make sure that I perform well, my teammate performs well, but at the same time, the team performs well as well. And how do you make a team out of people who actually aren't all individual, extremely good performers, but together they make a really good team? So I started understanding the complexity. And then I started becoming more and more interested in the ecological approach because I'd been talking to a lot of dynamicists and I'd sort of worked really hard on trying to understand dynamical systems theory. Then I ran into a lot of ecological psychologists, and then I read some work that kind of combines some of these theories together. And I have to say, I mean, and that's also, I mean, I hope that's clear from the book and also from the title, is that I don't consider ecological dynamics as a causal framework, right? There's not much evidence there that really gives us causal links between A and B that we can go out to coaches and say, if you do this, it's quite likely that this is going to occur. But it offers an interesting conceptual and theoretical framework that automatically attracts coaches to it. Coaches already apply some of these concepts, so they automatically get interested when you talk about it. And I needed an in because I worked in Australian football. Australian football is 18 versus 18 players with about 100 interchanges. It's incredibly complex. So we needed a way to try and understand that complexity and at the same time translate it to coaches who were already using some of these concepts to try and frame what they were doing in a sort of larger sense. And that's where we became interested in the concept of ecological dynamics. And I have to say, I'm doing a lot of empirical work on the side because I think what is really lacking in this area is more empirical work. And sometimes we focus a lot on, writing another opinion piece and another opinion piece and a theoretical piece. And it sort of becomes overwhelming. And the first thing we hear from practitioners is always, I love it and I love the ideas, but the jargon, it's so confusing and I don't understand what it means. And we've really, in this book, we've really tried to get away from some of the jargon at times, incorporate enough of it to understand the complexity of the theories in themselves, but get away as well so we can offer something tangible to practitioners.
Yeah. No, I really like that approach. And I like, you mentioned Jane. Like, I think, that's some of her papers that I think are really good entry points because she explains it, dynamical systems in a very relatable way, and talking about patterns and things instead of complex like attractors or something that's harder to understand. Yeah, I really like that. So, so you're kind of looking at, you're providing evidence and summarizing evidence on kind of the team coordination, from both between players and across the teams, and looking at these patterns. It's kind of, it's a big thing. Where did you kind of start with getting into this?
Yeah, so this started, obviously it had a practical origin, right, with lots of us who wrote together on the book, Reese Triboulet, Will Sheehan, and myself working in professional sport at the time. So we had a keen interest in what was practically viable, but Will at that time also started a PhD, and he became really interested in applying some of these concepts, or looking at some of these concepts further. And at that time, we were particularly interested in spatiotemporal measures of behavior, because it was, GPS units were getting a bit better with higher frequency. We were getting more accurate data that was better filtered through external providers. We had heaps of skill-related data available. So this was really our entry point into understanding how we could apply ecological dynamics to better understanding collective behavior in Australian football. And that led to the emergence of a performance analysis department at this organization, but also embedded students who worked within the organization, trying to help coaches to design better practice, or practice that optimizes learning. But we really became interested out of practical necessity, and then felt this real connection with the theoretical framework when we started looking at it deeper.
Yeah. And I know you kind of separate things into kind of different levels: macro, meso, and micro. Kind of the macro level, you're kind of looking at overall patterns like centroid analysis, display, thing. Can you talk a little bit, kind of being analyzes the whole team as a unit? Can you talk a little bit about that first? Yeah.
Yeah, so at the macro level, we're interested in things like, for example, what is the separation between the two teams, right? Where, and this is putting my coach's hat on, right? When you have a larger space in which teams train, then you automatically have more separation between the two teams. So that's kind of like the inter-team, or the lowest level of coordination, right? It's often in many studies, they use centroid analyses, which basically, if you take two centroids and you look at their sort of synchrony or their relationship with one another, that becomes it becomes dyadic synchrony again, but the centroid then becomes the average of the positions of the team players. And then you have the meso level, where we actually look within a team, and we've built that research curriculum out a lot more by starting to look at cooperative passing networks as a measure of understanding complex passing behavior in these teams. So we look at who passes to whom, how often does that occur, which are the different patterns of passing coordination that occur, which are particular passing lines that are employed often, etc. But you could also look within a team, for example, at how dispersed the team is. Well, we know that, for example, when a team attacks, they're much more dispersed in football and soccer than when a team defends when they're less dispersed. And then you can look at the micro level of coordination here, where, and we all know these studies, the dyadic synchrony studies, where you look at what is the distance between two players, when are they in a sort of in-phase relationship, when is that in-phase relationship broken based on the distance getting larger or smaller between these two players. And when you bring all of that together, that allows you to look at units within, individuals within subunits within units, which is a typical sort of dynamical systems way of viewing these sort of complex entities that are sporting teams that have individual players with individual roles, who have to contribute to a larger team aim, and the collective aim is often different than the individual aim.
Yeah. No, and I think it's really interesting. And for someone that's, hasn't encountered these ideas before, can you tell, like, what can we do with this kind of, like, obviously lots like planning, lineup, strategy, all the way down to practice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the easiest, I was going to say easiest, but very few things here are very easy. But the most straightforward way is to use this information in a performance analysis department. Mm-hmm. So often what we did, for example, we would use these cooperative passing networks, and we would look at who are the most central players in the opposing team, and what happens hypothetically if we would close these players down. Okay. Does that mean that the information, the passing exchange, then happens through other channels? And are those channels more dangerous or less dangerous? To give you an example, I'd have a central figure in an opposing team as a player who plays the ball backwards all the time. Then leaving that player a lot of ball possession is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because they're not necessarily threatening from their possession. But if there's another player who doesn't get the ball as frequently, but every time they get the ball, they play forward, or they play the ball to other important players who, for example, score easily or create goal-scoring opportunities more easily, then that becomes really dangerous. And it's often better to close those players down than it is to close the most central player down. So this is in the context of a performance analysis department. And then the second part is more of how do you design on-field training, right? For example, we know that if you increase defensive superiority, for example, you have 5 defenders versus 4 attackers, then we know that the attackers have to demonstrate more variable running patterns, because the only way to get in possession of the ball and to keep possession of the ball once you've received possession is to be more unpredictable, mm-hmm. right? So we know that, for example, and we can then go and measure what happens, and we don't have to measure it. Lots of other studies have done that before, and we've also put a table for practitioners in our book that they can have a look at. What happens when you increase defensive superiority? What happens to the defensive team? What happens to the attacking team in these different kind of collective behavioral metrics? But these are the 2 big areas where I would say this work is applicable: performance analysis and then optimizing practice.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think I think you point out like some work that's kind of maybe been ignored a little bit. I think, people always want to see the comparative studies of the constraints-led approach versus something else, but the studies showing what different constraints actually do, right? What's going to happen when I put, like you said, so this gives a theoretical, a methodology for understanding and being a bit more thoughtful and deliberate about the constraints you use, rather than just, okay, let's do 5-on-3 with 2 nets, or, like people get very creative, but this gives a way to kind of understand what it might cause, what it might afford, and things like that, right?
Because the ultimate goal, especially in dynamical systems theory, is also to provide some sort of prediction, mm-hmm. some sort of mathematical equation of what the behavior is likely going to be. And we're very far off, right? Because not every team, when you play 5 versus 4, is going to react in exactly the same way. But there are some basic relationships between these manipulations and the behavior of the team that we can likely predict are going to happen. Of course, coaching is an art as mm-hmm. well as a science, and we all know that. And that's why the best coaches don't just apply something they've written down at home, but they see how it goes. But one of the things that we're working on really, really hard now is to bring some of that work back to some of the older, let's say, Kelso finger wagging or walk to run transition related work, where we try to manipulate the control parameter. Mm-hmm. In this case, let's say the numerical superiority of the defense gradually, to see how much of that input of the control parameter we need to get that behavioral change to occur. Okay. Of course, again, we know that that's not the same across all teams, but I do think that it's a step in a step in the direction we need to get some more empirical evidence for that, for treating ecological dynamics more as a practical framework, or maybe even a causal framework down the track, while really we treat it as a theoretical conceptual framework at the moment.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. That's something I think about a lot. A lot of the concepts, intrinsic dynamics or something, are based on, very well-controlled, interlimb coordination, finger studies. Whether or not we can scale that up in a usable way to a soccer team, right? That remains, like, in theory, yes, but whether, there's a lot of work to be done to make it usable. Yeah.
And in my opinion, I don't have a hypothesis either way, but I find it very important that I put some empirical evidence behind this, so we can say, it's been tried and this is kind of what we see. Which direction are we taking it in now? Because obviously, scientific discourse and the whole scientific rationale is for it to be iterative, right? So we take the work that's been done, we build on it, we try to scrutinize maybe the prevalent theories, or in this case, ecological dynamics, and we see how do they hold up to that scrutiny. What if we try to break them and they don't break? That's a good thing, right? So I'm taking it. I'm trying from my perspective to, as much as possible, get empirical work going that allows us to test some of these central tenets and see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, and I'm sure, like, the dynamical systems approach kind of, the example you gave a little while ago about getting this unpredictable kind of result of shutting one player down, I think that captured nicely in dynamical systems, this kind of complex system nature of sports. So yeah, I think it's a natural fit. So how easy is it for someone that wants to do this kind of performance analysis now, in terms of tools? You mentioned there's GPS everyone's wearing, so the data is definitely there, right? Almost every team's collecting it, but to kind of do these kind of analyses, is it getting more accessible, or?
Interestingly, despite the fact that more work gets published on it, I feel, even for me, right, and this is what I do day in, day out, it's getting less accessible for me, because we get more interaction with engineering. We get more and more data every time, right? We get better at analyzing that data at different levels at the same time. We start using engineers and mathematicians and statisticians, and then I'm out. And I'm never the smartest in the room, and I could get by knowing a little bit here and there, but it's getting increasingly complex as the world gets more specialized. I think, the future for tactical analysis in performance analysis belongs to engineers and mathematicians, no longer to us, but the translation of it, what it means, sitting in front of a coach. I've said it so many times to my students, the most difficult conversations I ever had was when all the coaches are sitting in a room, they're staring at you, and they want you to say something meaningful based on something extremely complex, and you need to sweat and work. And I haven't met an engineer or a mathematician in my sort of line of work who can do that. That's where skill acquisition specialists come in. We are the translators of very complex knowledge into something that means something to someone who doesn't care about the complexity of the knowledge, who just wants a reasonably simple outcome.
Yeah, no, I can totally. Was in this week where it was for some people I was taught. We were kind of talking the difference, the terms we were using, the data versus information. Right, I can give you a whole bunch of data with a whole bunch of numbers and reports, but I need to. For a coach, they need information from that's usable and actionable, right? All these, but that, and I would sympathize also with your, every time I think I'm getting the grasp of something like biomechanics, there's new measures coming out that are more detailed and, and how they fit in. So you're right, it is challenging, and I know it's one of those things. Going back to what we started at the top, it's one of those things. Instead of making it open to people, it's probably going to be. Someone's going to develop some software that you have to buy, and or you have to hire or even more so, you have to hire their company,
yes,
to do.
And
it.
that's another reason why we decided to make this open access, because we hope and of course, I mean, we're fighting a massive storm here with a very bad umbrella. But I think we're trying to do our part in making this accessible, and hopefully, someone who's not a trained exercise scientist or who has a PhD degree in something related to this might look at this and say, look, I'm actually going to apply some of these basic concepts with my local team, and they can grow and learn. And all of a sudden, I mean, the one thing I keep noticing, I go to ecological psychology conferences, and I'm out of my depth. Right? They talk about all kinds of things that I don't understand. I go to dynamical systems conferences and I'm out of my depth. They talk about all kinds of things that they don't understand. So I imagine how difficult it must be when you haven't studied this stuff, or you don't do it day in, day out, just to be able to access the newest knowledge that's out there. So we hope that this gives some people some leverage into this area who want to apply it in their own, not backyard, that's not the right way of saying it, but in their own local organization, maybe, with someone who's rehabbing from an injury. Maybe they want to apply it as a practitioner, physiotherapist or rehab practitioner instead of with a sports team.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. It is, that's like back to this. It's hard to get the information. Most conference presentations, most journal articles are written for people that are deep in the weeds of it already, right? The first paragraph is for a general audience. Yeah. The first 2 minutes of a talk, that's it, and then they're down to right in there. Even I have the same as you. When I go something a little bit outside my area, I have a really hard time keeping up with, because it's so specific and detailed to that area. Yeah.
And I feel like I feel it a lot because I hover over a few different areas. So I kind of jump from one to the other, motor development to motor learning to general performance optimization in sport. And I kind of see these. All of a sudden, I've been away for 2 months, and there's all this new information, and I'm lost. Luckily, I have students who they do a lot of the bulk work of kind of compressing that information into meaningful bits. But it just, I just don't know how a practitioner nowadays would still do it to catch up. It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah. And the other thing I just was, when I'm thinking of reading this, although it's framed in soccer, football, I think its concepts apply to any team sport, right? Or even individual, like dyadic sports, tennis, play, right? They're the same kind. It's a good way to kind of understand some of the basic, concepts and terminology and things.
Yeah. And we also thought, I work for Science and Medicine and Football for the journal as well. So I see a lot of this work, and I know there's a lot of good work going on in football in this space. It doesn't all get published. It's difficult, especially a lot of these studies are descriptive and sort of focused on a single team, etc. But I knew there was a lot of really good work out there, and football is a popular game. Everyone, even if it's not your game, you do understand the basic relationship between attack and defense and what a successful attack and defense is. So it again made it more accessible to the broader public to focus on football, even though none of us at that time, all of us were involved in either rugby or Australian football. We had no relationship with football whatsoever, soccer then in that case.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting. The other one thing I wanted to ask you about is the STORC, the Society for Transparency of Openness and Replication in Kinesiology. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so STORC, and I hope I don't say anything wrong here, but STORC is an organization that they do workshops specifically focused on increasing more reputable kinesiology research or sport and exercise research for people in other areas of the world. And they do a lot of good workshops around statistics, around handling missing data. And I'm particularly interested in that sort of area of improving our research methods, because that's something that I feel we lack from time to time as well. And I don't know, because it is that we've sort of got a Napoleon complex a little bit, and we sort of have to make sure the message is really good, but then sometimes we forget about the science. And I've done it many times as well, but I'm trying in the last years now to make deliberate efforts to improve the rigor of my research, which isn't easy to do, right? And I fully understand. So I was really interested in partnering with them to release this book, because I knew they could do it diamond open access, which means I don't pay, nor does anyone pay to access the work. We only pay to put the work together. So if you have to, sort of pay for figures and things like that, but it's all basically sweat and tears. Right? That's put this book together. So therefore, now everyone can access it. But they've been really supportive, and I think it would be a great outlet also for other people here who are thinking about putting open access books together, or they've also got Communications and Kinesiology, which is a journal that's diamond open access. So if you're interested in other people accessing your work, of course, I mean, the indexing of those journals, I don't know exactly how that works, and some people still have sort of old school performance metrics they have to satisfy. But if that's not you, and you feel that this is a good outlet for your work, I think it's great to take a look at it. If everyone can read your work, that's excellent. And I heard they've got a really good review board as well, that's really, constructively critical, let's say, especially in the context of research methods. So we were really keen to work with them, and we were happy that they said yes. They published one other open access book, which I believe is an introduction to exercise psychology textbook, which is free to access for everyone. So every lecturer around the world can use it, as well as every student, without their libraries having to pay fees or them having to buy those books. So I think that's a good thing.
For sure, I agree. And I also, the tightening up the sports science research, that's not unique to us. Every field is kind of going through this issues of replication and openness science, and I think it's good in so many ways. Sports science, has its own unique, we work with unique populations and things like that. It has unique issues you have to deal with, but they only can get better by kind of people tackling it. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, because now with the student Lee and Cho, we looked at all of the different within subjects and between subjects randomized control trials that existed in motor learning research focused on the learning of sport-specific skills. And there's only maybe 120, 130 studies that really form the evidence base that we take. It's our backpack, right? Whenever we go out and we go and talk to coaches or other people, we're wearing this backpack and we're going, this is the evidence behind external focus of attention or contextual interference, etc. And I was a bit surprised by the fact that evidence base was actually relatively small for sports skills. So, I mean, organizations like that, and in general, encouraging sort of the better practices in sports science research in general, not just us, but everyone, is a really good. I mean, it benefits us all.
Yeah, I agree. We just have to, and I'm glad we're valuing these things. I'm sure it was the same when I first started, and I'm sure you as well. These kind of pure direct replications were not. Nobody did that, right? I'm gonna test it internal focus, but in another sport or another different. Right? You always have to be doing something different. There's no value in doing a direct replication, but now we realize how important they are. Yeah.
So. And when I look back at some of my first work, right, and I look at it now, I knew that in the time when I wrote it, these things were completely normal. But dichotomizing a continuous variable just like that, without thinking or without looking at a different analysis. Nowadays, we just don't do that anymore, right? Because we've advanced, and these are small things, but we've advanced to telling people where our missing data went, are they actually systematically missing or missing at random? We're trying to do a better job of telling people whether the assumptions for certain statistical analyses were met. But when I wrote my first work, that was never an issue, and I didn't know about it. But I'm happy I know about it now, so I can encourage my students to do different things, but also I can try and make my scientific practice different, hopefully.
Yeah, same with, power now, like how many participants should I have? When I started, it was like, I don't know, 20 sounds like a good round number. Right. There was no logic to it whatsoever. All right. No rationale for picking the number of participants,
And it's under the push of these new meta researchers. And I mean, me being a meta researcher is now also oftentimes a full-time job. It didn't used to be the case, right? But I know many departments where meta researchers work in postdocs or sort of early career fellowships, etc. Yeah. And they keep us all accountable. And I think it's great. I mean, I want to be told when I'm not doing something right, because I understand I can't be and a statistician and someone who's really good at designing experiments and at the same time a people person, so I can get the right participants in and encourage them, and at the same time know everything about the ethical conduct of research. It's impossible to do all of that together. It's just become too complex. So I'm happy these people are there.
Yeah. And I also think, obviously there's value in creating your own research and adding to the body of knowledge. Doing like you've done here, where you take other people's work and you combine it, interpret it, and integrate it. That's so important, right? We need more of that, and beyond just kind of, but in meta-analyses and reviews, I think I'm glad to see more and more of those kind of things come in.
And there are some good young researchers working on replication studies. Brad McKay comes to mind. He's not too far from you there. They're actually putting together large-scale replication studies of, previous studies that we just assumed had good evidence embedded within them, but they're going through the whole motion. They're getting funding. They're doing it the right way. They're attracting people to work with them. And I think that's great. I mean, that's where our field needs to move forward by doing that, getting better recognition, becoming, people have to have confidence in the fact that when we find things in scientific research, that these findings are real. They represent the actual world out there, right? So that confidence increases as we get more people doing this sort of stuff, and it makes our job easier as specialists, as academics, as practitioners who work in skill acquisition.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. So I would highly recommend everyone have it's a great book, and a great price, obviously. But either way, if you had to pay for it, I would. So, is there? I'll put the link to this. But where can people go to find it?
So if they go to the Stork Kinesiology website, they can click through to books, and it's registered there as one of the books, and they just click on it and they can download it, read it there, link it anywhere else. That's all up to them.
Perfect. Yeah. And as you mentioned, you're very interested in people that want to reach out and comment, collaborate, feedback of any type. That's part of your kind of motivation.
Just have a conversation. You're young and you're new to this area and you want to talk about something you don't quite, understand. I can't tell you. I mean, there's a chance I don't understand it either, but we can not understand it together, and that makes it.
I love that. I've done a lot of that.
Yes,
that's fun. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm hoping people reach out. I'm hoping people want to talk about this, and I'm hoping it's a conversation starter.
Yeah. No, I think it definitely will be, and I definitely encourage people to go get it. So thanks very much for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Gone straight away.